I am a liberal Zionist. I believe in a two-state solution, one where Palestinians are given a state that allows them to live with the same self-determination and dignity as I wish for Jews in Israel. I am a Palestinian anti-Zionist. I believe Zionism is a racist, settler colonial ideology. The occupation it established in my ancestral homeland is a cruel and violent apartheid system. While I don't support Netanyahu or his far-right government, framing Zionism as anything other than Jewish self-determination is anti-Semitic. I want peace, not violence. By ending hate, we can approach the question of Israel-Palestine with compassion and reach a harmonious conclusion. My grandmother, along with her entire family and village, was displaced in the Nakba, which began in December 1947 after the UN partition plan agreed to carve up Palestine in a way which unfairly favored the proposed Jewish state. My grandmother is older than the state of Israel and still has the key to her home, which she took with her when she fled attacks by Zionist militias. She should be given the right of return to her home that was stolen. These claims come from a deep-seated hatred of Jews in the Arab world. Anti-Zionism is fueled by anti-Semitism because it denies Jews the right to self-determination. Jews were oppressed for thousands of years until we finally returned to our ancestral homeland that was taken from us. We return to our rightful land to which we have a deep spiritual connection through our identity as Jews. While Zionism is definitely a Jewish movement, globally most Zionists are Christians, not Jews. And today, only about a third of Jews in the US identify as Zionist. The original Zionist movement was only made possible by powerful Christian men in Britain, most of whom were anti-Semitic themselves. Even the early Jewish Zionists were mostly secular, and they were deeply resentful of orthodoxy and any native Arab Jews already living in Palestine. Refusing to support an oppressive modern state pretending to uphold Judeo-Christian values while simultaneously oppressing and slaughtering innocent people is not anti-Semitic. Jews fleeing both Europe and the Arab world offered Palestinians a two-state solution many times in the first half of the 20th century, but the Arabs always refused. They were majority Muslim, and their anti-Semitism is well documented. After the Holocaust in 1948, Jews who had fled to Israel won the War of Independence despite Arab attacks from all sides. Israel became the only democracy in the Middle East, and that is what we continue to fight for today. Zionist militias ethnically cleansed my grandmother's village after the end of the British Mandate in 1948. Their settler colonial movement declared a new Israeli state after an organized campaign of rape, massacre, and forced depopulation of hundreds of Palestinian villages in what they called Plan Dalet. Arab armies did not attack until Plan Dalet was already well underway. This ongoing land grab by the Zionists became even more blatant when, in 1967, Israel started the Six-Day War in a surprise attack on Egyptian fighter jets while they were grounded, which the Israelis called a preemptive strike. The early Zionists may not have always been kind, but they were brilliant strategists and did what they had to survive. The Nakba was a tragedy, but don't most modern countries have a dark past during their foundation? None of that changes the fact that today, Israel has a right to exist and must continue to exist as the only safe haven for Jews. If you admit that the Nakba was a tragedy, then you must support the Palestinian Right of Return, right? If you admit that my grandmother, her husband, her children, and her children's children should be able to return to the land from which they were displaced during that dark past, then we don't have to squabble over whose version of history is correct. I want those homes that were seized to be returned to their rightful Palestinian owners, and for the millions of refugees to be able to return to the land from which their families were chased at gunpoint. Obviously, that's not practical. Jews have lived in the state of Israel for generations now. We cannot simply force them from their homes. Well, Israelis force Palestinians from their homes every day, so it can't be that hard. Listen, even if we don't require all of the stolen buildings themselves to be returned to their original owners, at least allow the 5 to 7 million estimated eligible Palestinians to return to Palestine, the land of their ancestors. Obviously, that's not possible. They would turn Israel into an Arab state. Israel must exist and must exist as a Jewish state. Sure, Palestinians were displaced, but so were hundreds of thousands of Jews from Arab countries. And Arabs have many countries they can live in, but Jews have only one. That framing of Jewish immigration to Israel after 1948 is reductionist, but even if it was completely true, you would still be denying Palestinians their right to return to their homes after they were ethnically cleansed. You're denying this simply because that would result in a demographic shift you don't like. That has nothing to do with peace or harmony, and everything to do with denying Palestinians basic rights so that you can maintain the Jewish supremacist apartheid state. Israel is not an apartheid state, and the whole concept of Jewish supremacy is an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. Jews are one of the most persecuted people in history, so we can't be supremacist. Israel exists because Holocaust survivors fled there because no one else would take them. Not a single thing you just said was true. And none of it responds to my original statement. Nearly every major international human rights organization recognizes the apartheid system in Israel, where Palestinians, both legally and in common practice, are not treated equally compared to Jews. There are streets only Jews can walk down and roads only Jews can walk on. No amount of claims about Arab Israeli citizens or the handful of Palestinians in high-ranking positions will change the fact that Palestinians as a whole are not treated equally in Israel, as admitted by Netanyahu himself when he referred to a nation state, not of all its citizens, but only of the Jewish people. Of course he said that. Netanyahu is an extremist far-right war criminal. Netanyahu is the extremist who killed 75,000 in Gaza, the extremist who said invading Iraq would create enormous positive reverberations, the extremist who has pushed US presidents to go to war with Iran for decades. Finally, he found a president who would say yes. Tragic. Israel may have lost its way to far-right extremists like Bibi, Ben-Gvir, and Smotrich, and settlers like Daniela Weiss. But that is exactly why we must do what we can to push the Israeli government back to the left so we can all live in peace. This is the fundamental difference between you and me. See, you believe that there is a version of Zionism in Israel that can be rehabilitated and does not oppress Palestinians. But you also can't concede the Palestinian Right of Return because Israel must continue to exist as a Jewish majority state. This fundamental contradiction, wherein some rights of Palestinians are honored but others are denied to perpetuate the ethno-state, is the crux of the cognitive dissonance inherent in the belief of a version of Zionism separate from displacement. Of course I support the right of return after a two-state solution is reached. They could return to their own state and stop attacking Israelis like they did on October 7th. Nearly a century of oppression and the decades-long blockade of Gaza since 2005 are what contributed to Al-Aqsa flood, not outright anti-Semitism. The October 7th attacks on Jews proved the Arabs do not want peace. What you call Al-Aqsa flood was an anti-Semitic attack, the very reason why Israel must continue to exist as a Jewish state. Look, I get it. You believe October 7th was an anti-Semitic attack on Jews and thus is an example of why Israel must continue to exist so that it can keep Jews safe. Correct. Except history didn't begin on October 7th, 2023. That violence was an uprising against a racist, oppressive regime that kills, abuses, and arbitrarily detains innocent Palestinians, be they men, women, and children, gay or straight, cis or trans, Muslim or Christian, every single day in Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. By September, the year 2023 was already the deadliest year on record for Palestinian children in the West Bank killed by the IDF. Gaza has been described by multiple international watchdogs and analysts with words like open-air prison, concentration camp, and ghetto. And just like the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, people subjected to such horrific conditions for an extended period of time will eventually rise up. Resistance rises from oppression. It is inevitable. What a monstrous thing to say. It's anti-Semitic to call the slaughter of Jews an uprising. International law never protects the targeting of civilians and non-combatants. True, but you're weaponizing the Jewish history of oppression to justify atrocities committed by Zionists today. We can condemn war crimes by both sides while also recognizing the staggeringly higher number of Palestinian civilians that have been killed by Israelis since the Nakba began. Collective punishment, indiscriminate bombardment, use of chemical weapons like white phosphorus, all of these are war crimes committed by the IDF along with many, many others, including targeting civilians and non-combatants, and using them as human shields. In the words of Holocaust survivor Gabor Mate, think of the worst thing you can say about Hamas, multiply it by 1,000 times, and it still will not meet the Israeli repression and killing and dispossession of Palestinians. None of that excuses the horrific attacks on Jews that occurred on October 7th. The attacks were against Israeli oppression, which uses Judaism as a shield to avoid accountability, exactly as you're doing right now. You are condemning the method of resistance while refusing to acknowledge the root cause of that resistance. Have you ever stopped to consider how many German civilians were killed during the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising? Would you then conclude that it was wrong for Jewish militias to rise up against Nazis? That's also an abhorrent thing to say. They were heroes resisting Nazi Germany. It's anti-Semitic to compare Jews to Nazis. How do you not see that? We are comparing Zionism to Nazism, not all Jewish people. That conflation is a favorite rhetorical trick of both Zionists and actual anti-Semites alike. The entire concept of Israel is using the tools of previous oppressors against those who would harm Jewish people. But this is merely a cycle of oppression and abuse that helps fuel anti-Semitism worldwide. It's practically a universal truth that when oppressed people are suddenly given power, they're most likely to in turn oppress some new group of people themselves because domination is the only model of power they know. But it's just as easy to learn a different lesson from that kind of history, which is that never again means for anyone, not just the Jewish people. That's a gross misrepresentation of history. The Arabs always attack us first. The 1948 War of Independence was a perfect example of Israel defending itself against anti-Semitic attacks because Arab countries didn't want us as neighbors. It was the same with the Intifadas and with the attacks by Hamas in October 2023, all because of Jew hate. Doesn't Israel have the right to defend itself? Doesn't Israel have the right to exist? No state has rights. Only people can have rights. States don't have a right to exist, nor do they have a right to self-defense. The only rights a state can have are sovereign rights, which exist solely to protect the people within its borders. But Israel dominates and oppresses Arabs within its borders because they're not Jewish, which is behavior that has fundamentally defined Zionism since its inception. The most relevant right here is that under international law, oppressed people have the right to resist their oppressors. No, it's Hamas that's oppressing its own people. The IDF, as the most moral army in the world, must free Palestinians in Gaza from Hamas terrorists. If the Arabs would only stop their obsession with killing Jews, we could oust Netanyahu for a more progressive government and get us all back on the road to a two-state solution. You keep dangling this amorphous second state as a solution. So tell me specifically, where would the second state be? At whose expense would it be created? What concessions are you willing to give Palestinians to create it? How much of the coast or arable land are you willing to give up? Will you consign Palestinians to stay in Gaza and the West Bank? After the genocide, only about 40% of Gaza's buildings even remain standing, and that figure is 20% in the north of Gaza. An estimated 68 million metric tons of rubble blanket the territory, with the UN reporting that clearing it would take over 140 years at the current pace. In the West Bank and East Jerusalem, there are now over 250 settlements sanctioned and protected by the IDF and the Israeli government. Are these the ruined and gutted lands you'll leave to the Palestinians? How many Israelis are you willing to displace to form this mythological second state? These are exactly the complicated questions that will be addressed once we get Netanyahu and his far-right government out of office. We could implement phased relocations of Palestinians with international guarantees. By working together, a UN oversight committee could, what you just described, has a name, and it's ethnic cleansing. These complicated questions surrounding the two-state concept have been asked over and over since well before Netanyahu came to power, and yet there has never been an answer. The Oslo Accords, for example, were mostly an excuse for the Israelis to further oppress Palestinians by implementing checkpoints everywhere. As Ilan Pappé puts it, the farcical two-state solution is a rotting corpse, and the only way forward is decolonization, the return of Palestinian refugees to their land, accountability for those who have committed crimes, and a new model of statehood for Palestine and the region. Ilan Pappé is a misguided, self-hating Jew. It's simply a fact that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, and Tel Aviv is the only city in the Middle East with a state-sanctioned pride parade. Meanwhile, in Gaza, they'll throw you off a roof if you're gay. It's the only democracy, the only progressive country, and the only safe place for Jews in the region, maybe the world. It must exist as a democratic and Jewish majority state. Oh, I'm sorry, I wasn't aware that the IDF had figured out how to ensure that none of the tens of thousands of Gazans it bombed in the last few years were gay. You do realize that you've just admitted that you think the Nakba was justified and the apartheid system should continue regardless of who is in charge of the Israeli government. No, I didn't. Yes, you did. By insisting that Israel must continue to exist as a Jewish state, You're also insisting that Palestinians displaced by the Nakba can never return home with true equality. There are about 7.2 million Jewish Israeli citizens and 2 million Arab Israeli citizens. Within the borders of Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem, there are another 5.8 million Palestinian Arabs under Israeli control. At the very least, there are another 5 million Arab Palestinians or so in diaspora. What's your point? The point is, even if half of the 7+ million eligible Palestinian refugees were to exercise their right of return, Jews would become a minority in Israel overnight. If Israel was truly equal, and if Palestinians could return to their homeland, then an equal vote in a progressive, equal, and democratic state would result in an Arab-majority government. This government would dissolve the modern settler colonial project known as Israel, thus returning the land to its historical name of Palestine. That's why even you, with all your talk of peace and equality, can't bring yourself to allow the right of return, which means you uphold the displacement of the Nakba and the apartheid system that prioritizes Jews over other ethnicities and religions. The land's not their homeland. Its historical name is Israel. The West Bank was Judea and Samaria. Zionism and Israel is the one that's a land-back movement. Both Jews and Arabs might have some indigenous claims to Israel, but Arabs are the ones who are too anti-Semitic to share it peacefully. The word Palestine didn't even exist until the Romans named it that. Okay, first, yeah, a small portion of the land briefly bore those other names, but Herodotus names the broader region Palestine predating the Roman creation of Syria Palestina by like 5 centuries. Second, not a single one of those talking points remotely responds to my previous statement. It's simply not relevant here, except to point out that you have been taught a heavily biased and often straight up incorrect version of the history to support the Israeli nationalist myth. Instead of responding to the contradiction I pointed out in the liberal Zionist view, you pounced on an opportunity to engage in the same historical revisionism used by the far right to justify the Jewish nationalist project. Just like the extremists you claim to want to remove, you're rehashing distracting disinformation to divert the conversation away from the inherent contradiction of denying Palestinians the right of return. Maybe you don't care about the history, but I do. There's a reason Jews say next year in Jerusalem. Again, religious folktales from thousands of years ago have no bearing whatsoever on this conversation. Zionism is a modern political movement started in the late 1800s by mostly secular European intellectuals who themselves proudly referred to their movement as colonization. They were not and cannot in any way be considered indigenous to a land they were foreign to. They had no desire to move to Palestine to live as equals, nor did they have the knowledge or ability to act as stewards of the land. Rather, they took the land over by force and formed a supremacist state fundamentally predicated on the oppression of the land's indigenous peoples. For this reason, the Jewish anti-Zionist movement is exactly as old as Zionism, including the original Palestinian Arab Jews, the Jewish Labor Bund, and most Orthodox Jews who still to this day consider the Zionist appropriation of Judaism as both repugnant and heretical. But you just admitted that our religion is exactly why Jews have an ancient connection to the land, which makes us indigenous. It's the Arabs who colonized Palestine during the Muslim invasion. We were there first. First, the spread of Islam wasn't colonial, it predated colonialism. It was imperial. It's different. They didn't slaughter, subjugate, and extract like European colonialism, the latter of which, by the way, is the direct tradition from which Zionism originates. Indigeneity is only relevant when it exists as a counterpart to colonization, and Jews can't claim colonial oppression in Palestine. And for the third time, 3,000-year-old biblical stories have no bearing on modern geopolitics whatsoever, except for pointing out that they're constantly used as a nationalist cudgel to avoid accountability. None of that's relevant to a conversation about ethnic cleansing, apartheid, and genocide in 2026, and please don't make me repeat that again. Look, even if we don't agree on the exact details, you can at least admit that this is exactly why we need to get Netanyahu out of the Israeli government. I support Israel, but I do not support his far-right government that has caused so much suffering for Palestinians. We should at least agree on this one point. I mean, Israel's most leftist leader, Ehud Barak, still oppressed and murdered Palestinians as well as Lebanese Arabs, and he once compared Palestinians to greedy crocodiles. Barak ordered the 1996 Gaza bombardment, the 2006 Lebanon war, and he was defense minister during the Second Intifada. All of that was self-defense. Maybe Arabs should stop starting wars they can't win. Israel has a right to defend itself. Israel has a right to exist. We are indigenous. We are oppressed. We have a connection to the land. If you really cared about Palestinian lives, you would support Israel's mission to remove Islamist terrorists like Hamas and rebuild Gaza. We just want peace. In the words of Kwame Ture, you can have peace and still have oppression. That's why there can be no peace before liberation. Under UN Resolution 194, Palestinians have a right to return to the land from which they were displaced, which, under an equal and democratic framework, would mean the end of the Zionist colonial project in Palestine. You know this, which is why you deny Palestinians the right of return. You know you have to ignore the ongoing Nakba so as to continue apartheid in occupied Palestine. You have to frame as self-defense the constant destabilization of Israel's neighbors and the Israeli policy of mowing the lawn in the Gaza ghetto, a phrase so common in Israeli parlance that it's been said by multiple Israeli leaders. You also have to deny Palestinians the inalienable right of oppressed peoples to resistance because, in this case, that resistance happens to target a group of militants who happen to be Jewish. As a liberal Zionist, you have to deny these basic truths to maintain the Jewish majority in Israel so Zionism can continue to effectively suppress Palestinian rights until all Palestinians are either displaced or killed. This is identical to the far-right position. The only difference is the language you use to support it. I'm doing no such thing. You're using a convoluted history and an anti-Semitic view of Israel to deny the Jewish right of self-determination. I'm fighting for peace, equality, human rights, and a pluralist democracy in the Middle East. What you're doing is reciting nice-sounding universalist platitudes to help you deny the particular reality of Palestinians on the ground. This is the fundamental tenet of the modern liberal. Words replace actions, and decorum takes precedence over substance. As I've pointed out multiple times, the very concept of a Jewish ethno-state in Palestine is not compatible with a true democracy without a deliberate apartheid system that perpetuates Jewish majority and supremacy. The Jews must have a state. Without a Jewish state, we are vulnerable again. You're asking for equality, but all you offer us in exchange is extinction. That is why we must hold on to what we have now. It's simply disingenuous to equate the dissolution of an apartheid occupation with extinction. In fact, states come and go all the time. Israel only persists because of a century of Western support, but most would now agree that that legacy relationship is crumbling. Support for Zionism is quickly becoming a primary issue for many US voters. Israeli society is imploding along several fault lines because of the constant state of cognitive dissonance that results from a highly militarized, openly racist, pseudo-fascist nationalist existence. Ever since the live-streamed genocide in Gaza began, Israelis have become a pariah worldwide, and more young Jews are turning away from Zionism than ever. The concept of Doikeit, here-ness, of building Jewish safety wherever Jews are found, is a far more attractive concept than continually trying to support one atrocity after another in Israel. That resentment is only growing, and most believe Zionism cannot survive another generation. I guess we'll see, won't we? Within our lifetime, we definitely will.